Salam alaikum and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today we are critiquing Dune, which is why I open with the Arabic Salam alaikum, meaning peace to your soul. So I'm critiquing Dune both in terms of the novel, the 1965 novel, the 1984 release, as well as the new 2021 release, comparing, contrasting, if you will, for just how subversive, and I mean the word subversive in a good sense, in the sense of what we expect from good sci-fi, good literature, to question the dominant thinking of our society, to question those powers that dominate our society. And in the case of much of the English-speaking world, we are looking at the power of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, as well as the fossil fuel petrochemical industries. But what you will find most compelling about my narrative is my critique of the timing of these releases. Now, as a sci-fi fan, I want to say I enjoyed both the 2021, the 1984, as well as the novel. All of them have what a sci-fi fan expects, rich in metaphor and transporting us to another world. But I want to give one caveat about the 2021 for starters. I'm disturbed by the role the actor of obvious Asian ancestry was placed in. I'll get back to that, and how that ties in with my overall narrative. So Dune lays out a world, transports us to a world, a galaxy or an interstellar human civilization dominated by different houses, with an overarching empire. Now the two chief houses featured are Atreides and Harkonnen. I know the movie pronounces it Harkonnen, the 2021, but I think Harkonnen is the proper pronunciation. Now, these imperial houses, these royal orders, they are exploiting a planet called Arrakis. Arrakis is a desert planet inhabited by people called the Fremen, and Arrakis is in control or is in possession of a rare substance called spice. Now here we are already seeing right at the offset these analogies between what people often call Western society or Western imperialism and its domination of non-Western countries, in particular, in this case, the Middle East, as it is a desert planet with a coveted resource. Now this spice feels rather like a mishmash of some type of cash crop, like from this imperial era, like opium, like the opium crops or the coffee plantations, as well as oil, as it's featured in a Middle Eastern-like setting. Now, I also say oil because spice is used for interstellar navigation in the movie, as it gives those members of what's called the Spice Guild the ability to navigate deep space through sort of like an extra sensory perception. So in this regard, spice is kind of like a mishmash of again, some type of a drug as well as oil. Now, the Fremen resisting the colonists, resisting the houses, feel in many ways to a viewer and a reader like Islamic revolutionaries within the Middle East, resisting the Western domination. So in 1965, when the book was first released, that publication date was not very far away from the 1953 coup in Iran, a coup little reported in our history, but really should be. In Iran at the time, the Iranians elected a socialist president who nationalized the Iranian oil industry, meaning he took it away from British Petroleum, I believe. And then the history, and I will cite this to PBS for you, it's just underreported, but it's true and credible history, nothing far out here. After the election of that socialist, President Mossadegh, the British appealed to the U.S., and then the CIA was involved in a coup overthrowing Mossadegh and replacing him with the Shah. So that 1965 book could be seen as metaphor for that. But interestingly, at that time period, a lot of the resistance to Western, if we want to call it that, or international business domination in the Middle East and other places was really coming from the left more than from Islamicists. But then in 1979 comes the Iranian Revolution to overthrow the Shah. Now, when I was a child, and if you're old enough to remember, or you were just paying attention when you were very young, you might remember our media portraying the Shah as like a likable character, and these Iranian revolutionaries as basically crazy, and leaving out all of the tortures, etc. of the Shah and the fact that he was placed by the CIA and Western powers to keep open Iran to those international business interests. Well, all that was left out of the media at the time, so now again, the novel Dune would still seem pretty darn subversive, in a sense even foreshadowing those Islamic revolutions. Well, without delving too deep into the history of Afghanistan, Afghanistan at this time period, getting into the 80s now, had some type of a leftist government, a socialist government, and at some point the Soviet Union moved in and occupied or backed up that government. However, we're viewing that situation in Afghanistan. So again, according to a PBS timeline, it was in 1984 when Osama bin Laden first appeared in Afghanistan resisting the Soviets. According to the PBS timeline, it was 1986 when the US, and it was President Reagan at the time, began to support that Islamist revolution, or uprising, known as the Mujahideen, which later gave birth to the Taliban. Now, I can remember the 80s, and I can recall Ronald Reagan, who was supporting the Mujahideen, referring to these rebels as freedom fighters. So now we see the 1984 release of Dune, and here we're seeing the timing. What I'm telling you is the timing issues, where it becomes a little less subversive than is now sort of supporting the dominant narrative, and that now the powers that be, if you will, or the military-industrial complex, or however you want to look at it, are now supporting jihadists or Islamicists against now the Soviet Union. Well, then as we get into the year 2000 and 2001, Afghanistan is used as a springboard for jihadists to hit the United States now in the 9/11 attack. I was troubled and disturbed at the time by the media's lack of introspection and leaving out our support, in quotes, because the public's barely aware of this, the support for the jihadist movements to hector the Soviet Union prior. Now, this lack of introspection paved the way for the Bush administration to launch a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan rather than a more sensible, limited operation, and it also paved the way for the invasion for the Bush administration to invade Iraq. Now, two sound bites from the 2001 movie jump out at me that seem analogous and therefore somewhat subversive, if you will, to the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. One is the Fremen live in caves, which reminded me of the Afghan Taliban hiding out in caves during the U.S. and Allied occupations. Second, the scene where the Harkonnens were bombing a city or a siege on Arrakis, which reminded me quite a bit of Baghdad, or a Middle Eastern city just based on the desert color schemes. And the Harkonnen bombing was quite spectacular, with heavy missiles landing and many explosions and bombs going off. Well, this reminded me of Donald Rumsfeld at the outset of the Iraq invasion, calling for what he called shock and awe, that the U.S. should shock and awe Iraq with severe and heavy bombing. Now, granted, there was some early 2000 releases of a sci-fi miniseries of Dune, but for the most part, we're not hearing much from it. When President Obama comes into office, he talks about having a pivot to Asia, which really comes down to moving U.S. troops towards Asia to pose them as what's called the threat from China. Now, while I'm going to criticize Obama and later Biden, I do want to point out that when it comes to environmental issues, at least, Obama and Biden and the Democrats in general are more responsive to environmentalists. But there is some truth in the leftist critique of both sides being the same when it comes to that military-industrial complex. So while we are now largely still in the war of terror, or war against terror time period, and Islamicists are generally portrayed in the media as a foe of the United States, there is still funding or support for uprisings in the Middle East and other places which will involve jihadists. For example, in Libya, the NATO allies gave plenty of air support to overthrow Gaddafi, and within those uprisings were jihadists, and a similar situation we saw developed in Syria, which spanned the time period from Obama into President Trump. Now, Obama remained mired, as the media called it, in the Middle East and was not able to successfully enact his pivot to Asia. Donald Trump came in on the coattails of a lot of anti-Islamic sentiments. No offense if you're a Trump supporter, but that is how it looked to me, or at least fear of jihadists. But Donald Trump did set the mood for the pivot to Asia by speaking about China, at least in derisive tones. So maybe you see now where I'm going with the 2021 release, but if not, I want to start with just backtracking to the spice as not only metaphor for oil, but also metaphor for drugs. And here I'm looking at opium in particular, and the whole relationship of colonies and the colonized and that type of thing. So Great Britain in the 1700s dominated the opium trade. They dominated poppy fields in India and cultivated them largely for export to China. Well, the Chinese emperor was none too happy and attempted to outlaw the sale and importation of opium to China. And this too, I will cite you to a PBS Frontline timeline. It is not far out history, but it is again underreported and very important history. Great Britain responded to that outlawing of opium by burning down the Chinese Navy. Now, this assault on China would be posed to the British public at the time, not as, hey, we are trying to force the sale of drugs on China, but it would have similar tones to the Cold War with China has today, which would be things like claiming unfair trade imbalances, and that type of thing. Well, that burning down of the Chinese Navy ushered in what many historians call 100 years of humiliation for China, where it was dominated by foreign powers. So along comes President Biden, now completing the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, which was initiated under Donald Trump, and now sincerely begins paving the way and creating that pivot to Asia, finding new justification for the military-industrial complex with a threat from China. Now, bear in mind also, China has a large Muslim population in its northwest quadrant called the Uyghurs. And it is my impression that this population is fairly brutally oppressed, and as the Chinese government is trying to forcibly assimilate them. But please keep in mind our underreported roles in supporting armed uprisings. Again, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, to name a few. Therefore, lending some credibility to the Chinese government fear that problems could arise in that region. Now, bear in mind the influence of these large industries in our media, and consider that the movie, the 2021 release, was released shortly after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the pivot to Asia begins in earnest. Now, just somewhat of a spoiler regarding the House Atreides doctor, played by one of the only visibly Asian actors of Asian ancestry, and I put it that way as visibly Asian ancestry because really all of us are mixed, as I like to point out, at some level going far back enough. None of us are really pure anything, and it's really only a few features and perception separating one group from another. But that Asian doctor is portrayed as, or plays a role of someone who's a traitor, sneaky and deceptive. Now, that's a common stereotype that's been foisted, I believe is the word, on people of Asian ancestry for a very long time now. And that sneaky, traitor, tricky role also fits the narrative of the pivot to Asia and the moving U.S. troop presence and allied troop presence aimed at China now, as one of the things we often hear in the media is they are stealing our intellectual property. And again, we're back to those unfair competition claims that we heard about during the Opium Wars. Nothing new under the sun. Well, before we part ways, I just want to touch on another aspect of the spice, its ability to increase ESP or extrasensory perception, and that whole theme within the movie Dune and the book. So we see the Bene Gesserit order. I pronounce it Gesserit, the movie says Gesserit. It is a nun-like order that is very spiritually disciplined. And interestingly, when I read the books, I noticed that some of the meditation or mind over matter techniques they practiced were indeed actually meditation techniques I've read about, like for instance, progressive relaxation. Now, throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, if we look at literature on meditation from that time period, it was much more focused on the development of other senses and mind over matter and that type of thing. But then what happened in the 70s, there was a lot of frauds were exposed. And then meditation became more, let's say, plain vanilla, really focused on like mindfulness and nothing is far out, shall we say. Now, I do believe this focus on meditation and spirituality is somewhat subversive in the sense that if one practices religion or spirituality or meditation, one is really forcing one's mind to stop and question the nature of reality, which I think can help snap people out of their consumeristic frenzy. But what about the idea of psychedelics and spice as a mind-opening psychedelic? Well, there I have mixed feelings about that, and I personally do not support the use of such drugs. I believe there is evidence to show they have a destabilizing effect on people's psyches. Further, when it comes to marijuana, there's even been songs made about paranoia. That's a commonly agreed upon side effect of the drug. Well, we live in a very paranoid age, so many say, and so it appears. So does introducing drugs that could potentially lead to more paranoia seem like something subversive or in some way supporting the dominant paradigm? Well, I hope you found this video very thought-provoking and interesting, and if you did, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel, you've clicked that notification bell, you're liking, commenting, and until next time, as always, peace be with you.